It was another busy afternoon at Park Café. Business elites and celebrities indulged in their gourmet meals, savoring the elegance of the upscale restaurant. No one paid attention to the small, ragged boy standing just beyond the patio fence. His oversized hoodie hung loosely on his thin frame, his dark eyes scanning the plates of food he could only dream of tasting. Malik, a homeless boy, was used to being invisible. But today, he wasn't just hungry, he was afraid. Inside, Bernard Green, a 72-year-old billionaire, sat at a prime table with his much younger wife, Marissa. In front of him, a steaming bowl of soup rested untouched. Marissa smiled sweetly, but in a fleeting moment, Malik saw her discreetly pour something into the soup. His heart pounded. He hesitated. Then, without thinking, Malik shouted across the cafe, "Don't eat that." The Park Café was a place of exclusivity, where the city's wealthiest came to dine in peace, hidden from the noise of everyday life. The scent of freshly baked bread and rich espresso filled the air, blending seamlessly with the quiet hum of conversations. At the heart of it all sat Bernard Green, a man whose name was synonymous with power and fortune. At 72 years old, he was a living legend in the world of real estate, having built his empire from the ground up. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his gold-rimmed glasses reflected the soft glow of the chandeliers above. His suit, impeccably tailored, spoke volumes about the kind of man he was: precise, calculated, and always in control. But today, something felt different. His movements were slower, his gaze more distant. He glanced at his menu, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Opposite him sat Marissa, his much younger wife, the picture of elegance. With jet black hair styled to perfection and lips painted a deep red, she looked like she had stepped straight out of a magazine cover. Diamond bracelets glistened on her wrists as she scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging her husband. She laughed at something on her screen, but the sound was hollow, devoid of warmth. Outside the cafe, just beyond the ornate patio railing, Malik stood unnoticed. The boy, no older than 12, had become a familiar face on this street, always lingering on the edges, always watching but never belonging. His hoodie was too big, his jeans worn thin at the knees. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he was used to that feeling. What he wasn't used to was fear. It had happened in an instant. Malik had been watching Bernard's table, not because of the man himself, but because of the untouched bowl of soup sitting in front of him. Then, he saw it, Marissa's hand slipping into her designer handbag. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just a casual movement, like adjusting a mirror or reaching for lipstick. But then, her fingers curled around a small glass vial. Malik's stomach clenched. His sharp eyes followed as she twisted the cap open with a practiced flick, tipping a few drops of clear liquid into Bernard's steaming soup. The liquid disappeared instantly. Marissa stirred the soup gently with a spoon, her expression unchanged. Then, she leaned in toward Bernard, whispering in a voice only he could hear. "After all I've done, you won't ruin this now." Malik froze. His mind raced. Did he really just see that? Could it be something harmless? But the way she spoke, the way her eyes glinted with something cold and final. A deep instinct told him this was wrong. Very wrong. He should walk away. He should pretend he didn't see anything. But then Bernard picked up his spoon. Malik's chest tightened. He had to act. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched lower behind the patio railing, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he had just seen, but every fiber of his being told him that something was very wrong. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. No one else had noticed. No one else had been paying attention. It was just him. The café bustled with life. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, laughter and chatter filled the air, and silverware clinked softly against porcelain plates. A normal day for everyone except for Malik. Across the patio, Bernard lifted his spoon, glancing briefly at his phone before dipping it into the soup. The liquid swirled, harmless in appearance, but Malik knew the truth. She put something in it, Malik whispered to himself, his breath coming in short bursts. Marissa, sitting across from Bernard, watched with calculated ease. She leaned forward slightly, her hand resting on her chin, a soft, expectant smile playing on her lips. It was almost as if she was waiting. Malik felt suffocated by the weight of his decision. He was just a kid, a homeless kid, at that. Who would believe him? He had no proof, no authority. He was used to being ignored, shoved aside, treated as if he didn't exist. If he accused a wealthy, well-dressed woman of trying to poison her billionaire husband, they would laugh him out of the cafe or worse, throw him out onto the streets. The logical choice was to walk away. But he couldn't. His eyes locked onto Bernard's spoon, now inches from his lips. Everything inside Malik screamed no. Before he could stop himself, he lurched forward, gripping the railing for balance. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that." The words cut through the noise of the cafe like a gunshot. A fork clattered onto a plate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A hush fell over the entire patio. Every head turned toward the small, disheveled boy who had just shouted at a billionaire. Bernard froze, his spoon hovering in the air. His sharp blue eyes narrowed as he slowly turned toward Malik. Marissa's reaction was instant, and fierce. Her head snapped around, dark eyes flashing with something almost primal. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through glass. Malik didn't back down. His hands trembled, but his voice, though shaky, rang clear for all to hear. "She put something in your soup. I saw her." A ripple of gasps swept across the cafe. Patrons exchanged confused, alarmed glances. Some whispered behind their hands. Bernard blinked. His gaze shifted from Malik to his wife. His spoon lowered slightly. "Marissa?" His tone was calm, but his hand trembled as he set the spoon down. Marissa's composure snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "You little liar," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" Her words stung, but Malik didn't flinch. He stood his ground, chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. "I saw you." His voice steadied. "You poured something into his soup when he wasn't looking." He turned to Bernard, his dark eyes filled with urgency. "You can smell it if you don't believe me." Bernard's face paled. He turned toward his wife. His sharp gaze now studied her carefully, searching for an explanation. "Marissa, what's going on?" A moment of tension hung thick in the air. Marissa scoffed, letting out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, please," she sneered, waving a dismissive hand. "Look at him. He's filthy, starving, he probably just wants money. Or food." She spat the words out like they were poison themselves. Some of the cafe patrons murmured in agreement. Others looked uncertain, their eyes darting between Malik and Bernard. Malik's chest tightened. He had expected doubt, but not this level of dismissal. But he couldn't let it end here. He turned to Bernard once more, his voice pleading now. Please. Just don't eat it. Bernard exhaled slowly, then reached for the spoon again, not to eat, but to bring it closer to his nose. A sharp sniff. Then another. His expression darkened. And for the first time, true doubt flickered in his eyes. Something was wrong. A suffocating silence blanketed the café. Every eye was on Bernard as he held the spoon just inches from his nose, his sharp gaze flickering between the bowl of soup and his wife. He inhaled again. There was something off. A subtle, bitter scent beneath the rich aroma of the broth. Something he hadn't noticed before. Marissa's perfect composure was beginning to crack. This is ridiculous, Bernard, she scoffed, forcing a laugh. Are you seriously listening to some street rat over me? Her voice wavered just barely, but Malik caught it. He stepped forward, fists clenched. His voice was raw, desperate. Smell the whole bowl. You know it's not right. Bernard hesitated. The café, once filled with idle conversation and laughter, was now dead silent. No one dared to move. Bernard set the spoon down and reached for the entire bowl, bringing it closer to his face. A slow sniff. His jaw tightened. He didn't say a word, but Malik could tell. He knew. Marissa's expression twisted. She was losing control. Oh, for God's sake, she snapped. You're going to let some filthy little beggar ruin our lunch? Her voice was sharp, venomous. But she wasn't looking at Bernard anymore. She was looking at Malik. Malik swallowed, his throat dry. He had seen that look before. The kind that people gave him when they wanted him gone. Like he was nothing. But he wasn't going to back down. Call the police, Malik said suddenly. His voice, though small, carried through the café like a gunshot. Marissa's eyes widened just slightly, but enough. Bernard caught it too. He exhaled, his fingers tightening around the bowl. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. Marissa, he said, staring straight at her. Tell me the truth. She held his gaze for a single, charged second. Then, in a flash, she lunged for the bowl, knocking it off the table. The ceramic shattered against the stone floor. The thick, golden broth spilled across the ground. A gasp rippled through the café. Malik felt his chest tighten. She'd rather destroy the evidence than let him test it. Bernard rose to his feet, slow and deliberate. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. You just answered my question. A tense silence gripped the café. The shattered bowl lay in pieces, golden broth seeping into the cracks of the stone floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Bernard stared at Marissa, his expression unreadable. But his hands, once steady, now trembled at his sides. Malik felt his own breath hitch. She had done it on purpose. She hadn't even tried to make an excuse. She had destroyed the evidence before he could test it. That meant only one thing. She was guilty. The realization hit Bernard at the same time. His face darkened. Marissa, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, what did you put in my soup? Marissa laughed. A sharp, brittle sound, not out of humor, but desperation. Oh, come on, Bernard, she scoffed, running a hand through her perfect black hair. Are you seriously doubting me because of some homeless brat's wild accusation? Her eyes darted around the café, scanning the onlookers, looking for allies. But there were none. People were watching. Whispering. The tide had turned. Even the waiter, who had been silently hovering nearby, took a hesitant step away from her. Bernard exhaled slowly. His entire body seemed heavier now, as if something deep inside him had just shattered, something he had refused to see until this very moment. "You think I didn't notice?" His voice was low, almost sad. "The way you've been distant. The way you've been waiting for something. Or someone." Marissa's jaw tightened. Bernard leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "I may be old, but I'm not stupid." A single beat. Then, Marissa snapped. "Fine," she hissed, slamming her purse onto the table. "You want the truth?" She leaned in, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the tablecloth. "You were supposed to die, Bernard." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A collective gasp rippled through the café. A woman nearby clutched her chest. Someone knocked over a glass. Malik felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. "Bernard?" He simply blinked. As if he already knew. "Why?" He exhaled the word like a dying breath. Marissa's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smirk. "Because I'm done waiting." Bernard stared at Marissa, his body rigid, his breath slow and controlled. But his eyes, they burned with something Malik couldn't quite name. Pain. Rage. Or maybe just disbelief. Marissa didn't look away. She had already crossed the line. There was no going back now. "I'm done waiting," she repeated, her voice sharper now. "For years, I've played the perfect wife. Sitting quietly while you controlled everything. Waiting for my turn. But you just keep holding on." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You should have died months ago, Bernard. You were supposed to be out of my way." Malik felt his stomach drop. She had tried this before. Bernard let out a slow, bitter chuckle. "So that's it, then." His voice was calm, but his fingers tightened around the napkin in his lap. "You wanted me gone. You wanted my money." Marissa's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't act surprised. You knew what I was from the start. You just thought you could control me." Malik couldn't believe what he was hearing. She wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. Bernard nodded slowly, like a man who had finally accepted the inevitable. Then he reached into his suit pocket, and pulled out his phone. A red blinking light flashed on the screen. "Recording in progress." Marissa's smirk disappeared. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. She had just confessed. In front of everyone. On tape. Bernard set the phone down on the table, his voice low and steady. "Game over, Marissa." Marissa's face drained of color as she stared at the blinking red light on Bernard's phone. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She had played her final card, and lost. The café remained deathly silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air like a noose. Then, a voice from the back of the café broke the silence. "Somebody call the police." A waiter rushed inside. Another customer was already pulling out their phone. Marissa's perfect exterior cracked. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Bernard, you wouldn't do this to me." Bernard leaned back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You already did it to yourself." The doors of the café burst open, and within moments, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. "Mrs. Green," one of them said firmly. You're under arrest. Marissa flinched as the officer grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. She didn't fight. She knew it was over. As the handcuffs clicked shut, she turned to Bernard one last time. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You'll die alone." Bernard didn't flinch. "Better alone than with a snake in my bed." The officers led her away. The café patrons, once silent, erupted in whispers. A scandal like this, it would be on the news within the hour. And Malik? He stood frozen, still struggling to process what had just happened. Then, a hand landed on his shoulder. Bernard looked down at him, his sharp blue eyes filled with something new. "You saved my life, kid." The café slowly returned to life, but for Bernard, everything had changed. He sat back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His wife, the woman he had once trusted, was gone, handcuffed and dragged away like a common criminal. She had wanted him dead. Not for love. Not for revenge. Just for money. A bitter realization settled in his chest. All these years of power, wealth, and control, yet he had never seen what was right in front of him. He turned to Malik. The boy who had saved his life. Malik stood there, shifting awkwardly, his hoodie still too big, his hands clenched into fists. He looked ready to run, as if no one would believe he had done something good. Bernard studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've got guts, kid." Malik swallowed hard. I didn't want you to die." Bernard nodded. "And because of you, I didn't." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. The café patrons were still watching, some expecting him to toss a few bills to the boy like a beggar. But Bernard did something no one expected. He didn't hand Malik money. Instead, he offered his hand. "Come with me," Bernard said simply. "Let's get you some food. A real meal." Malik blinked, hesitant. No one had ever said that to him before. After a long pause, he slowly reached out, and took Bernard's hand. For the first time in years, Malik felt something foreign stir in his chest. For the first time in a long time, Malik sat at a table with a warm meal in front of him. Not scraps, not leftovers, real food. A fresh steak, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. He hesitated at first, staring at the plate like it was a trick. But when Bernard nodded, Malik grabbed the fork and ate. Bernard watched him in silence. He had spent decades building an empire, making billions, controlling industries, but in the end, it was a homeless kid who had saved his life. Not his wealth. Not his power. Just a boy who had nothing, but still chose to do the right thing. Bernard set his glass down. "Tell me, kid. Where are your parents?" Malik stopped chewing. His grip on the fork tightened. He didn't answer. Bernard nodded, understanding. "You don't have to tell me. But you don't have to be alone either." Malik looked up, his dark eyes wary. "What do you mean?" Bernard leaned back in his chair. "I mean, I have more money than I know what to do with. And you," he smirked slightly. "You just saved my life. I think that deserves more than just one meal." Malik blinked. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying, let's change your life, kid." For a moment, Malik didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Then, for the first time in years, his lips curled into a smile. The world had never given him anything. But today, he had earned his place in it. And Bernard? He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted his money. Today, he had found someone who valued something more. Loyalty. Courage. Integrity. 2 lives had changed that day. And neither of them would ever be the same again.